Hemp is quite well spoken from a very sustainability point of view. It is from a net effect point of view. It's tremendously more sustainable than some of the other default choices or the more dominant choices that we have around us today. While all the awesomeness is said about hemp and some more natural fibers, one of the most unique things is hemp actually takes very little water to grow the plant versus cotton.
Hi everyone, welcome to the first edition of Bending the Lines, a circular lens of industries. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Shashwat Gangwal and I'm the founder of InfinityBox. It is my earnest request to all of you to tune in and spread the word. Because after all the pandemics and the war's end, one war which we will always be fighting for is the one for our planet and for our future generation. Today we have Sanvar Oberoi joining us. Sanvar, along with 6 of his friends, founded BOHECO 7 years ago. Tackling the narrative of cannabis being nothing but marijuana, BOHECO has been leading India's hemp revolution across food and nutrition, clothing, fabrics, packaging, any vertical you name it, and BOHECO has made inroads there. Having been recognized at the parliamentary level and having seen a 3x growth in revenue in the last 3 years itself, BOHECO has been creating the ecosystem of hemp industry in India and helping lay the foundation of a sustainable fashion industry. Sanvar himself is a World Economic Forum shaper, has been recognized by Forbes in its 30 under 30 Asia list, and was featured by GQ in its top 50 most influential Indians. The list of his accolades is just endless. Most importantly, though, Sanvar is an inspiration to all young entrepreneurs who are looking to establish a sustainable business in the field of textiles while tackling some very strong preconceived notions in the society. Thank you for joining us today, Sanvar. It is an absolute pleasure to have you. BOHECO has become a well-renowned brand today. How does it feel to be amongst the pioneers of the sustainable revolution in the fashion textile industry?
Oh, well, thank you, Shashwat, and sort of congratulations for this amazing work you guys are doing. And in fact, we're going to talk later, I guess, about sort of what the role of cultural organizations that sort of storytell to people. The narratives should people know about. So thank you for doing this. It's long been needed. We're definitely a bit more known now. I don't think that we're there yet from the point of view of mass adoption or even for our target audience that we have in mind. But nevertheless, I'm glad that at least now there's more work and more conversations. Clearly, sort of that's why I sort of thank you at the start. This podcast is an example of. But I'm just glad that there's more work, which of course there's a bit more awareness, but there's a lot more conversations about sustainability even from a fashion and textile point of view, which definitely wasn't the case about 10 years ago. And I want to highlight one more thing, which is I found out very recently, just this week. So the World Economic Forum in Davos this year, as a part of their programming, had a dedicated sort of track and session towards sustainability in the textile space as well, which is very sort of rare. You wouldn't normally see conferences of this sort, which are very sort of economic and policy and definitely technology oriented, to actually start talking about some very, very sort of different industries. But I guess that as people starting to realize that how to save the planet is a whole sort of thing from all points of view, I guess this is sort of the elephant in the room that largely goes unspoken about. So yeah, I'm glad more of that's happening.
I couldn't agree with you more that there's definitely a lot of conversation happening around the entire concept of SDG. So when I was reading about the fashion industry, I think it was a huge surprise to me, and I think it has come as a surprise to a lot of us listeners as well, that it is the second biggest polluting industry. I mean, just 1 kg of cotton takes like 20,000 liters of water to be produced. And to bring that into perspective, right, 85% of the daily needs of water of the entire Indian population, 1.4 billion people, can be covered by the water used to grow cotton in the country. It's quite overwhelming, these facts, right? So and given that, I think what would be very helpful for our listeners is if you could shed some light on the textile value chain, right? Because you've been dealing with it for the last 7 years. What are the different stages of the value chain which lead to this much pollution?
Very sort of, this is what I alluded to when I earlier mentioned sort of the elephant in the room, because largely plastics of course get spoken about quite a bit, and a whole bunch of sort of different aspects within sustainability and saving the environment, but sort of fashion is exactly sort of that thing right in your face, or well, technically on your bodies, but that largely goes unmentioned. Here's the thing: the best way to understand why this is the case, and first of all, the entirety and exactly what you said, your facts are on point. In fact, there's even more startling facts from a global perspective when you start looking at sort of very large numbers. Anyway, here's why this happened. You can largely break up the entire textile supply chain or the fashion industry supply chain into three components. There's everything to do with the cultivation slash raw material sourcing. Okay, so that's the cultivation. Either you grow something, or in some chemical thing you're doing somewhere something which is the more synthetics, but it's the original production. Then there's post harvest or post processing. There's a lot of treatment a lot of these crops have to go through to ultimately get to a stage where it's even considered as then a textile raw material. Right, so there's immediately post. It's like somewhere in the agro processing space, technically from an industry or sectoral sort of view. And of course, the final sort of piece is the entire textile or fashion oriented processing, which is all your dyes, your printing, your waste to manufacture things, your cutting, your packaging as well, your distribution. It's everything sort of in the final creation stage of this chemical processing versus say water usage. There's a bit of prioritization and localization needed as well. There isn't one solution that fits all. Like again in every other scenario. Even in this, there isn't one solution that fits all across the board. But textile supply chains globally are built in very unique ways to their local geographies. Like I'll give you an example. Bangladesh, and again, there's a lot of content on Netflix and a whole bunch of different platforms that sort of really bring to light. And there's some very show this, and I'm actually drawing from that because there are sights and sounds of Bangladesh where because they have a lot of denim processing kind of problems that develops in their local sort of environment is very unique to sort of just that self versus say what it causes in parts of Maharashtra where there's a lot of cotton farming, for example, or parts of Gujarat there's a lot of cotton farming. So the textile supply chain has somewhat of evil sides itself, but very unique evil sides to their own sort of geography. So I was just alluding to that it is a tremendous at number two from an environmental I'd say damage point of view. But again, that word can be broken up into subcomponents and it's quite complex, which is why it's been a bit hard for one organization across the board to come in and sort of change everything. But instead, it is a task force of interdisciplinary work needed to be done, and which is why now there's a bit more happening on the space, even from collaboration's point of view of the supply chain.
Right. So that's quite interesting, right? Because you're saying that each crop has its own negative/positive effects on the environment, and that's the reason that you don't have a one solution that fits for all, or you don't have a common body going against or setting up rules that would help reduce the pollution from all sorts of crops. But then if that's the case, so I mean I think I would and I think all our listeners would also want to know something about to bring this into perspective, the Bangladesh example that you talked about. So what are the unique effects of denims in Bangladesh? If you could just shed some light on that briefly, so that we understand how difficult it gets, or what are the problems that these crops cause.
The very specific problem that causes, and again, a lot of imagery and content available to sort of visually see this, and it's quite sort of it does leave sort of an emotional imprint on you. Here's the thing: denim processing is a very unique thing where the colors and the dyes used to make denim the way it is, as well as, and that's the default denim. And once you start talking about sort of more what's called like faded and cut and processed sort of formats, the kind of dyes and chemicals that uses is a very, very toxic one to give it that very classic denim look and for the longevity of the material. And fair bit, so corporate incentives are aligned clearly one way. But now what happens is, so far, of course, to be honest, a lot of work has been done. Well, a fair bit of work has been done and is ongoing. So it'd be incorrect to say that everyone is still in 2000 or 1990. For the longest time, a large parts of the backyards of the processing areas of Bangladesh, especially sort of the specific districts and cities, that would end up having all of those affluents basically get washed away into sort of local water, and so basically the lack of processing post facto, and the kind of then there's a domino effect that goes from there, because of course there's an impact on flora and fauna, but there's a more immediate impact even from a human quality of life point of view and a healthcare point of view in terms of the kind of diseases or very specific chemical reactions that would cause on the hands and legs of some specific workers. And so, of course, now the fashion industry is hopefully moving towards sort of getting to be more mindful of that, because while your advertisement in sort of downtown sort of New York or downtown LA, your hoarding will say one thing, but the same brand is responsible for a very different thing. Finally, now content is coming out there to sort of try to show the masses that hey, the brand that you've been sort of you've been loving all these years is actually simultaneously causing this, if not directly doing it, but they're the big giants, right? Who can it's controlled from the top.
Wow, that's quite insightful. So basically, the scale of the problem is something that we as laymen do not realize. But also, there's a lot of work that's going on, is what you're telling me. So that's great. But I think, so if you talk about some brands like Patagonia or Levi's, they've done quite well, right, in moving towards more sustainable practices. I was reading about this Chinese brand called Y Cult, which just raised $50 million, and they promote reusable clothing. And that is a concept that is coming up, right? So there's been a substantial amount of progress, like you said, in the sustainable textile industry across the world. But despite that, and this is a fact that I read up on, that only 15% of the clothes are recycled or reused, and the rest 85% are dumped into landfills or incinerated. And you know why this surprises me, especially as an Indian? Because I come from a family where old clothes were given to our helpers, where torn clothes are used for dusting or they're reused, basically, right? I just have to ask, like, what has changed? What has led to this problem growing to such a scale?
Okay, well, that's a very interesting one, and this sort of brings about another sort of revelation. You're right, in the sense that India, as well as a whole bunch of Southeast Asian cultures, in fact, cultures even across, societies are built in unique ways across the world, and there are many cultures across the world where there's a whole sort of concept of reuse, where that material, and it's not necessarily only textile oriented, but that object sort of finds a second life and a third life and a fourth life, and so that's quite common practice. I want to actually sort of directly sort of point the finger on this one. Actually, it is a corporate problem. It'd be incorrect to say, hey, industry, it's your fault, or hey, consumers and populations, you're not acting correctly. Usually it's a combination of both. Most sort of integrated solutions would need a bit of behavioral shift in populations, as well as a bit of a business model updation, I'd say, within corporates, right? And so this is a classic case where I'd say the corporates have actually not walked the steps as much, because you're right, in a sense, populations and societies actually have a tendency to sort of reuse or second use or third use. Here's what I'm actually going to tie into the fact that okay, so the fashion and textile industry is very this is a very common practice of dead stock and dead inventory, right? Now it's very hard if you're a manufacturer, you're a brand operating even out of, say, Barcelona. You have to make your extra small, medium, large, extra large. In some cases you have to do, so the 5 options, sometimes you do 7 options, you do 9 options in terms of sizing, and so each of them from a production point of view lands up sort of you have to do runs of hundreds and thousands, in fact, well, millions of garments. I don't know how to solve it. I mean, well, there's work going on, and there are VCs investing in the space as well, but demand predictability actually can solve one of the most critical challenges in this. And of course, you can go into 3D printing and things of that sort. Directly getting to what you exactly asked, a very large percentage of this inventory that goes back into landfills, textiles that go back into landfills, is actually quite a bit lands up being unsold inventory, which is quite odd. If you really think of it, it's one of the most, I find it one of the most injustices being done to humanity, because it is perfectly well usable material that man has taken effort to sort of create and get to the point where it is a utility item. It just, if it's not up the season, it didn't sell within that season, it didn't sell in the next year's sort of clearance sale. We have a very large problem of unsold inventory. Here's sort of classic 101 case of a space available for an entrepreneur, or startups, or makers or hackers to come in and sort of find solutions, creative, nifty solutions to a very, very large problem that could actually land up saving money. It could be profitable. But how do we solve for, if you're a brand, you have 10 stores across 10 Spanish towns, and you need to stock each of them with each of these sizes, and so you need to have and enough of a depth in your product, not just width. So you'll end up sort of making all of this, but your XS doesn't sell in this one, or your XL doesn't sell in that one, and so you try for the next season, it doesn't sell. So what do you do with that? There are some solutions that have come up, but not of the global scale that is needed to solve the tonnage of problem that we have right now.
Right. So if I got that correctly, demand predictability is the major problem that's affecting the industry, and that I think is inherently caused by the changing consumption patterns that we've had. The whole idea of fast fashion developing. So people from Indians who were reusing their clothes, we have gone into this trend of fast fashion, where we keep on getting new clothes. The life of every item is like 7 to 8 uses now on an average, as per many studies. And that is the problem that brands are facing on how to tackle with, because they want to sell, so they have to make as many things as possible. They're not able to manage their inventory, and it goes into landfill. So I think it's this consumption pattern, these patterns that have developed, that I think we need to tackle along with the unsold inventory.
For sure. So that definitely goes into a bit of the harder challenge in terms of how, honestly, how do you really create behavior change at scale, right? And I guess that we're going to go into that a bit in a later question. But I guess that like I mentioned, the role of cultural institutions is absolutely critical in this piece. I mean, they're the mouthpiece to society on how society should function and what the new things are, and how you should live and how you should make purchasing decisions as well. I mean, there's a role of advertising, but as well as content as well. And so work needs to definitely be done on that in terms of how do we move away from mass consumerism or sort of with a bit of sort of the angle here of a bit of introspection and mindfulness in terms of how much is enough. But that's a whole movement that still has to happen at scale. And like I said, the cultural institutions have a critical role to play in that.
The reason I brought that up as well was that the brands that we just spoke about, they've been focusing on the consumer phase of the value chain, right? And I think it's true for the majority of the initiatives across the textile industry. But BOHECO, on the other hand, is amongst the very few companies in the pre-consumer phase. So first of all, kudos to that, right? But I think it would be great for us to understand two things. First is, why are the big brands not focusing on the pre-consumer phase? Secondly, what are the different set of challenges that as BOHECO you faced while tackling the other side?
One key thing to know is how is the textile industry structured and organized, right? And so just so that people know this, obviously Gucci or obviously H&M or obviously Levi's for that matter as well don't necessarily run their own factories. Like standard sort of model in business, the industry's, I mean, and it's textile, so developed, it's so well developed over so many decades and centuries that the way the industry is organized is you have a bunch of players who are the big daddies in terms of manufacturing and production, and you have some big companies out there who are on the more B2C and brand side. Now, of course, these two work quite a bit together. There's a whole bit of movements have happened where India used to be a very critical sort of piece, and now India still is, but it's of course moved into sort of the Southeast Asia of the world, Vietnam and Philippines, and like I said, Bangladesh. Which China was a major player in this as well, and everyone's moving differently on the value chain, trying to sort of go up and, well, not down, but up the value chain. Here's the thing, man. To be honest, we didn't have a choice. In our case, my point of view, wear the hat of a founder, wear the hat of an entrepreneur yourself. You're in 2012. You just discovered that, hey, India has this. Well, it's not a new discovery, to be honest. It's always been here, but for us, it was a new discovery that, hey, India has this sheer abundance of hemp and cannabis that just grows literally in abundance across the Himalayas. In fact, actually quite a bit across the country as well. But just like lands until your eye can see till the horizon, just like fields of hemp, and which have largely been ignored by I'd say policy, because it was. I'll tell you what, it's actually been ignored by industry first by recognizing or thinking that cannabis only equals marijuana, or it only equals intoxication, weed, or any of the words that you want to use there. Whereas and just going with it from a blanket point of view, assuming that this crop has no other economic value. But when you really look at agricultural economics and you look at, hopefully as a society, we start straying away from monomonetization, like where you don't grow crop only to sell one part of that crop, but instead you actually take a more holistic view overall. Rice is a great example as well, where earlier only the grain would be sold and entire money from rice farming would come from selling the grain. But hey, what about this sort of 3-4 kilos of this other rest of the plant that actually may have economic value? But anyway, so coming back to hemp, this crop to grow in abundance. Yes, you don't want to use the flowers of the plant for intoxication purposes or medical use, at least back then. So can you at least take the rest of the plant and make some use of it? So from our point of view, when we came across that, we recognized that, oh dear God, there's just a sitting opportunity where all of this ready raw material has to just get processed. Of course, it's easier said than done, but get processed and ultimately become this amazing material that the world needs from an industrial hemp point of view, from textiles or paper or building material or food, vegan foods. It's right in front of us. Here's sort of the golden opportunity. But then as soon as sort of that dawned on us, it also sort of simultaneously we realized that, oh wait, this entire industry is absolutely unorganized. I mean, technically it's incorrect to even call it an industry from a 2012 2013 point of view. When you look at it, there's literally no industry, there's no organization. This crop has never been bred in India, so we have to go do seed research to develop the basmati equivalent from a cannabis point of view. There's no ready seeds. I can't just take wild jungly forest seeds and just sow them in an industrial farm. So you have to do seed genetics and seed research. Then you got to work with farmers on how to cultivate this crop in a proper organized manner, so you improve yield and productivity of the soil, but also the yield that you're getting per acre. Okay, then you got to work towards, okay, fine, you've grown the crop, now you harvest it, but okay, I have a hemp stick in my hand, but I want to get a hemp t-shirt on my body. And so like that entire sort of phase in the middle is a whole sort of it. And again, not to say that it's not been done. So we were not doing anything in India that hadn't been done in the world, but instead good examples in the world where this stuff had been done at small scale. And so I cannot just go ahead and invest in a $500,000 machine that does harvesting, that processes the hemp fibers and separates the outer and the inner fiber that do processing after that. I can't go buy a $500,000 machine that exists in some parts of Western Europe or some parts of big farming in China. These are the two, or some parts of Canada as well. So these are the major hemp growing regions before sort of India sort of stepped on the map. And so we need to create India-centric solutions. And so in our case, we have to actually work across the supply chain. Okay, how can I separate my fibers? How can I then put the fibers into whatever processing, hopefully not chemically intensive, a raw material that can become yarn. And then, of course, so here's the thing. The key thing, by the way, if anybody ever is thinking about disrupting the textile value chain, but of course, there's one way you can work building a new brand, things of that sort. But on the other end, the textile supply chain is very well organized once you make something yarn. So if there's anybody out there who's thinking about becoming a textile entrepreneur, and from a new materials and a whole engineering and science point of view, there's a world out there that as long as you grow mushrooms or you grow sugarcane or you grow bamboo, as long as you can convert that into a format and a raw material that the yarn manufacturers can then take in to themselves, from that point on, the industry is well organized. So to be honest, we actually didn't do a lot of innovation post yarn. We did everything to convert this very raw, jungly, wild cannabis plant that we found in the mountains to how do you make it that I get good quality, consistent yarn or raw material for yarn, which is like processed fibers, to the yarn companies on their doorstep. That was and is and will for some more time continue to be one of the hardest things that we have been working on.
You told me the problems that every entrepreneur faces: funding, unorganized sector, and India-centric solutions. But then what you also told me, and I think is quite helpful to everybody out there, is how to disrupt the value chain. Because all these big brands, this huge money is going into the consumer-centric solutions. And you guys figured out a way to not go that way because of the problems that an Indian entrepreneur faces, and figured out the other aspect of the value chain, but then you helped set the entire value chain up. So I think with BOHECO, we have seen a movement towards a more sustainable space, like I was talking about earlier. And I think this entire setup that you have made with research, the network that you've built, and I think it would be a good platform, an amazing platform for a lot of young entrepreneurs looking to set up their own shop in the sustainable space in the textile industry. So I think that's pretty great. And coming back to the question that I'd asked, which is why the big brands not focusing on the pre-consumer phase, from what I get from you is because it's just too much effort to get into that when they have the brand power.
Well, yes or no. To be honest, I want to again, give kudos where kudos is deserved. To be honest, at this stage, including, so while of course it started with the Levi's and the Patagonias from the big brands point of view, while it started, it's more West Coast. It started from sort of the West Coast of the US and Canada, and of course you can see that wave move east, where sort of course and Nike's West Coast as well, but even big guys like Adidas and Puma and Nike and for that matter H&M as well and Zara as well have been, well, again, so now you can see that some brands I can say with a lot more surety, whereas some brands I can say with I got to think twice about it, because standing on, for example, on Zara is that yes, while they're doing they're doing a bit, not to say they're not doing anything. No, at this stage, if you're a brand, you're that big a brand, you can't not talk about sustainability. So thank God we're at least at that stage where it's a default. So thank God. But the question is, each of these brands are at a different part of the spectrum in terms of who's saying what versus who's doing what. And okay, I'm fine if Zara even talks about it. That's good enough. I mean, it's good enough to begin with, because at least gets the word out. Because if they start talking about stuff, people start getting to know a lot more. But I wish that they would follow up their more action than what they currently do. Here's the thing: the best way that any of these brands can actually, what they actually are doing is work with the supply chain partners. All of these guys have some amazing contracts with long-term supply chain partners. I will, go in and say that even many of the brands that I mentioned, including Zara, have at least made all of their, and I know this firsthand. We work with the same sort of production houses. A large part of the production houses across not just India but Southeast Asia are now needing to get compliances on board, which don't necessarily, sustainable fashion is not just about the actual material and the environmental impact only. The sustainable fashion can also mean in terms of worker rights and worker conditions. And so a lot of these brands are at least trying to get a lot of the supply chains in order from, hey, we need and social audits, and actually paying top dollar to firms, and not just sort of it's a side project for them, but it's a very core critical project for them in terms of social audits from a worker health and worker sort of a safety and happiness point of view, but also from a materials point of view. They're actually trying to get some of these audits and certifications in place. So the industry is getting on board. In sense of top down, the top brands are starting to talk to their manufacturing partners to start moving towards this. Here's the thing. So far, what the next stage that'll happen is, okay, here's a cotton T-shirt. Here's cotton T-shirt in 2010, which is, not much considerations were made toward it. Here's a cotton T-shirt in 2020, 21, where it's made a bit more sustainably. The workers had better conditions, so on and so forth. We've been a bit more careful on what kind of packaging do we use for this, and so move away from single-use plastic. Okay, that's sort of the next stage. The stage after that definitely should be, and by the way, there's amazing work happening across the world where, from a materials point of view altogether, going back to sort of the raw material in terms of, should you use cotton or should we use hemp or should we use so biosynthetics? The entire industry of biosynthetics is quite geared towards amazing sort of things where you have lab grown artificial leather and things of that sort. So material science and material engineering is now starting to come into even spaces like fashion and textiles, and so maybe we're going to see a wave of that going into the future, and brands are, in a sense, as the top dogs in all of this, orchestrating a lot of this movement happening as well. So these are kind of some steps that are happening along the way, and but I think the ecosystem is trying to align towards sort of making big changes happen over the next, say, decade.
I think that's quite interesting, right? I don't think I knew about the social audits, the material engineering space, how much innovation is happening in the space to make it more sustainable. So I think my next question would have ideally been, how do you see the industry evolving, right? Because there's still a huge chunk of the market which is unaware of the harm that we just spoke about. So it's great that these brands are, make these brands with the reach to billions of people are actually making that effort. So, but then let me ask you something else, right? So is it forced, or are the brands actually doing it because they care about it?
I'm very optimistic for the future in this, and I'll tell you from two different perspectives. Real quick, one is from the consumer side, and second is from public markets. So there's a new set of reporting norms in public markets and across the world, including India, but in New York Stock Exchange as well. So the only reason I'm going to that kind of an angle here is, see, ultimately, well, we live in capitalism, right? We live in sort of modern day capitalism, and you got to see how are corporate incentives aligned. Who do corporates even listen to? So whether it's forced or whether, how can it be aligned in such a way that the environmental sustainability perspective in fashion, how do you align that into corporate incentive? Because once it's aligned, then it's not even a compromise. It's not pushed. It's not forced. It's in fact, then they and you know how corporates are. We're in the same thing anyway. But how all of us are. If corporate incentives are aligned, then the corporates will bend over backwards and make it happen, make sustainability happen in a way that it blows our mind at what even population has been asking for so far. But here's the thing. So ESG norms, right? ESG norms, which are basically public market norms, and stock markets and public markets across the world are mandating ESG disclosures, which is environmental, social, and governance disclosures. Of course, when we've learned from the past, we've arrived at this because we've learned from the past, where companies are now actively being audited, actually have to have by default auditors who report on their ESG, I'd say, practices. And so, it's environmental is right up there along with social and governance. The earlier debate that yes, immediate profitability is what is driving man towards fast fashion or just mass consumerism, and that's what's leading to resource crunches and resource constraints, right? And we're depleting our resources faster than ever because we're headed towards we operate in a quarterly profit driven world. But finally, because of, I wouldn't say that this is early stages. We've not come the entire cycle yet, but because of at least the introduction of ESG norms, and I know for a fact that decision makers now make decisions with a combination of looking at quarterly profit, but also factoring in ESG scores of companies, we're finally seeing where, yes, H&M is now, say you're the CEO of H&M, you can now make a bit of a compromise in your profitability to get your ESG scores up, that, yeah, I will now make my supply chain partners move towards a bit more expensive material. That's again, it's again, some of these materials are just expensive because of economies of scale. Cotton is farmed or synthetics is produced at the scale, which is why it's the price it is at right now. So, but anyway, so they can now start giving contracts to other materials or other sources of production, or even the same things, but to produce them better, well, which will cost them more, yes, and which will take a hit on their P&L statement, which will take a hit on their revenue earnings, but at least it starts getting the ESG score up, and investors are rewarding them for that decision. So finally, the CEO of H&M can maybe, in his good intention and good heart, can actually start doing things that even he's been wanting to, but in fact earlier he couldn't, because he had to drive and strive towards quarterly profit. So one sec. So that's on the top down point of view. That's from a public market investor point of view. CEOs and top management can start heading towards that. Consumers, right? So now we're seeing a shift in generations, right? So not again going into sort of baby boomers and Gen X and Gen Z and millennials and that kind of conversation, but you're seeing a rise where a whole generation is, so I mean, the 90s kids, right? So 90s kids, 80s kids, we grew up sort of, you had Captain Planet on television, and so we had some very early sort of, nudges of, okay, there's, you gotta care about the environment somewhat. And we had some of those kind of things growing up. But now, this next generation growing up, seeing Leonardo sort of doing what he's doing, seeing the content there's on Netflix, seeing what even their icons, their fashion icons across Bollywood as well as Hollywood starting to talk about and wear things on red carpet. Not technically, you have green carpets now. All of this kind of stuff in Gen Z sort of growing up, and we're growing up in a world where climate change is, and Greta doing what Greta is doing, and again, and meme culture sort of promoting that and boosting that as well. I think Gen Z is definitely growing up in a world where we understand sort of the what's about to come, and they are actively trying to make more decisions on that front. And so I'd say that companies now are on both ends are surrounded. So whether even if they had the intention or not, many of them I believe would be well intentioned, are now aligned. Even their customers are asking for this. Their public market investors are asking for this. That's the holy trinity. Then this is still fairly new, but 5-10 years, once all of this starts setting into place a lot better, we're going to start seeing. It's amazing. I'm very, very excited and optimistic for the world to see the kind of work that if H&M has to take up the cause of sustainability because the customers want and the public market investors are demanding it, what would H&M do if they have to become 100% sustainable, or have 90% of their conscious line and only 10% of their non-conscious line, which currently is very low in terms of percentage as part of their total offering. So yeah, that's my view on this.
Wow. I think this is quite interesting, right? So I think this takes us back to the first thing that we spoke about, that from not talking about it, the sustainability aspect, to wondering whether it's needed or not. Today, it's there, right up there, like in your P&L. It's against profitability, right? So it's amazing how the industry has moved. And like you said, if the consumers are wanting it, and if the ESG norms are there, then we should be optimistic about how the industry is going to go forth. But then let me ask you something else, right? So how do you see that for India, specifically the Indian landscape, given that you've been dealing with the value chain for 7 years and have been working with the regulatory authorities, given hemp's nature? How do you see that evolving in India?
Oh man, you talk about India. One of the things I'm actually quite a little bit afraid of. So this is where a little bit of my pessimism will come in. And it's a call to action, to be honest. Okay, so here's the thing. I'm very worried about tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities. Worried from the point of view that what's happening there. So, see, you and I will talk about sustainability. I have my network, you have your network. Once the podcast comes out, we'll share it within our network. So there's which is with that network. Well, of course, there's a bit of tier 2 now exposure, but that it's definitely not the tier 3, tier 4 and villages in terms of our active sort of your and my network. Netflix as well. We spoke about all of this stuff, but where all of this awareness is largely contained within defined socio-economic circles, and it is a reality of the day. I'm a part of that same circle, and I'm just aware of it. In the sense, now, one of the most critical things is how can you have potentially. So I'll tell you something that really I feel a little bad about. And if one good thing with somebody hearing this podcast, if this change can happen, Myntra, as far as I understand, and sorry if I'm incorrect about this, but Myntra, as the giant that it is currently in terms of delivering products, especially to tier 2, 3, 4, or tier 3, 4, two may now stores have come up, but where a lot of stores don't exist, and Nike may not have a physical presence through a distributor in tier 3, tier 4, but tier 3, tier 4 is where aspiration is. It's a new India. but internet has reached there. They're seeing what people are wearing on Instagram and TikTok and whatever else, and so they have that aspiration and they have spendable sort of income, and so they're ordering things on Myntra. Myntra does not have a filter. You can't even put a filter on called sustainability or sustainable growth. But they're a key stakeholder, especially when I say tier 3, tier 4, because they're aspirational to them. These conversations are not reaching them. We're clear on that. B is even the portals from which their consumption is being driven are not promoting this. Or I'm not saying let go of your current business, but slowly, as a responsible stakeholder as you are, start introducing this because Myntra reaches them, which currently your podcast and Netflix may not. We're not talking in a vernacular language. I probably will not be as emphatic and be able to explain this in a vernacular language, and it's my fault. But we don't have a vernacular set of and vernacular is not just Hindi. Then it goes into all of those languages. We do not have vernacular content that's talking about these things, and so it's a big thing where it's not just the most alas the thing in this would be that if Bombay and Delhi and Bangalore have sort of switched over to sort of a bit more woke and evolved sort of people, but the mass consumption drivers, which is the rest of the country, so still continue to be in the old mindset. Idly through content, idly in vernacular and institutions across the board, we need to sort of work towards getting everybody, at least from an awareness point of view. And so I wanted to sort of just chime in on that piece.
Wow, that's quite insightful. And I think what you've highlighted is a problem that we're going to face in this entire movement towards sustainability, especially in India with the tier 3, tier 4, and even tier 2 cities. And that's not just India, actually, that's the entire developing world. And we have to figure out a way to solve this. And I hope that the young entrepreneurs who are coming up will be able to focus on this, and even the policy makers focus on this. This has been quite insightful, Sanvar. Thank you for sparing the time today. And I hope with this podcast, people actually start talking to others, and we see a better shift or a more expedited shift in sustainable practices being adopted in the fashion textile industry.
Hey listeners, I really hope you enjoyed this podcast. Stay tuned for weekly episodes on Bending the Lines as we give you a circular lens of industries. Do follow InfinityBox and support us in the journey of a circular world. Until next time, this is your host Shashwat Gangwal signing off.